The office of Preston Marketing Group buzzed with its usual morning energy. The smell of coffee wafted through the air as employees hurried to their desks, carrying steaming cups and sharing quick hellos. Among them was Ray Chen, a senior account manager whose presence seemed to brighten every room he entered. Ray wasn't your typical corporate success story. He'd started from scratch, working his way up from an entry-level position to become one of the company's most valuable assets. His desk told the story of his achievements: photos of smiling clients, achievement certificates, and a small trophy from last year's company awards ceremony where he'd been named Employee of the Year. "Hey, Ray," called out his colleague from the next cubicle. "Those numbers from the Johnson account are incredible. How do you do it?" Ray smiled warmly, remembering the late nights he'd spent perfecting that presentation. "Just trying to give them exactly what they need," he replied, his modesty genuine rather than forced. Over the past 3 years, Ray had transformed the company's client portfolio. Small businesses that had initially signed up for basic marketing packages were now full-service clients, thanks to his careful attention to their needs and innovative campaign strategies. The junior staff often gathered around his desk during lunch breaks, soaking up knowledge as he explained complex marketing concepts in simple, relatable terms. But lately, something felt different in the office atmosphere. The change had started subtly around the time the company founder, Mr. Preston Sr., announced his retirement. His son, Robert Preston Jr., took over as CEO with grand promises of modernizing the company culture. At first, the changes seemed minor. Ray noticed his meeting suggestions were being overlooked. His emails about new client strategies started getting delayed responses or none at all. During team meetings, Preston Jr. would check his phone while Ray presented, only to become suddenly engaged when others spoke. One morning, Ray arrived early to prepare for a major presentation to a potential client, a contract that could double their department's revenue. As he rehearsed in the empty conference room, he caught his reflection in the window. His crisp suit and confident stance reflected years of experience, but there was a hint of worry in his eyes that hadn't been there before. The old cleaning lady, Mrs. Rodriguez, who had worked there for 20 years, noticed his concern as she emptied the trash bins. "Mejillo," she said softly, "I've seen many changes in this building. The good ones stay good, no matter what." Ray smiled, grateful for her wisdom, but couldn't shake the feeling that bigger changes were coming. That afternoon, as Ray organized his files, he overheard Preston Jr. talking to the board members in the hallway. "We need to consider our company image," Preston Jr. was saying. "Some of our clients have specific expectations about who represents them." The words seemed innocent enough, but Ray felt their weight settle uncomfortably in his stomach. He pulled up his performance metrics on his computer screen. Client satisfaction rates at 98%, revenue growth consistently above target, positive feedback from every department he'd worked with. The numbers told a clear story of success, but somehow they didn't feel like enough protection anymore. As the day drew to a close, Ray stayed late, as he often did. The office grew quiet, except for the gentle hum of his computer and the distant sound of traffic below. He opened his drawer and pulled out the handwritten thank you note Mr. Preston Sr. had given him last year. "You represent everything this company stands for," it read. "Excellence, integrity, and genuine care for others." Ray carefully tucked the note back into his drawer, straightened his desk, and gathered his things. Tomorrow would be another day, another chance to prove his worth, though a nagging voice in his head wondered why he still needed to prove anything after all this time. As he walked to the elevator, he passed the wall of company photos, decades of Christmas parties, award ceremonies, and team buildings. In the older photos, he noticed how the faces grew more diverse over time, each new addition making the company stronger, more vibrant. He hoped that progress wouldn't become just another picture on the wall. The security guard waved goodbye as Ray pushed through the revolving doors into the cool evening air. "Another late night, Mr. Chen," he called out. "You work harder than anyone in that building." Ray waved back, managing a smile. If only working hard was all it took, he thought as he headed home, his mind already planning tomorrow's battles. The big presentation day arrived with the weight of expectation hanging in the air. Ray had spent weeks preparing for this moment, rehearsing every slide, anticipating every possible question. The Riverside Tech account could transform their company's portfolio, and he knew the pitch inside and out. The conference room slowly filled with executives in pressed suits and power dresses. Ray noticed how Preston Jr. chose to sit at the far end of the table, his expression unreadable behind his laptop screen. The potential clients from Riverside Tech settled into their seats, their interest evident in their attentive postures. "Good morning, everyone," Ray began, his voice steady and warm. The first few slides went smoothly. Market analysis, competitor research, proposed strategies. The Riverside Tech CEO nodded appreciatively at the detailed insights. Then it happened. "I think what Mr. Chen means to say," Preston Jr.'s voice cut through the presentation, "is that we have more traditional approaches available." Ray paused, maintaining his professional composure. "Actually," he continued, "our research shows that innovative digital strategies would better serve." "Perhaps we should move on to the next section," Preston Jr. interrupted again, his tone dismissive. The room grew uncomfortably quiet. Ray could feel a shift in atmosphere, like a cloud passing over the sun. Throughout the hour-long presentation, Preston Jr. continued his subtle undermining. Each interruption felt like a small cut, precise and purposeful. The Riverside Tech team exchanged glances, clearly confused by the dynamic they were witnessing. After the meeting, Ray stood alone in the conference room, gathering his materials. His hands shook slightly as he collected his notes, not from fear, but from the effort of containing his frustration. Through the glass walls, he could see Preston Jr. laughing with the clients, smoothly taking control of the relationship Ray had spent months building. The next few weeks brought more changes. One by one, Ray's major accounts were reassigned. First, the Cooper project went to a junior account manager who'd been with the company barely 6 months. Then the Blackwood portfolio was redistributed for better resource allocation. "It's about cultural fit," Preston Jr. explained during a team meeting, his eyes never quite meeting Ray's. "Some clients feel more comfortable with certain representatives." The words hung in the air like smoke, choking the room with their implications. Ray started keeping a detailed journal of every interaction, every email, every reassignment. His notebook filled with dates, times, and carefully quoted conversations. The weight of documentation felt heavy in his briefcase, but somehow necessary. The office dynamic shifted too. Colleagues who used to stop by his desk for advice now hurried past with quick, apologetic smiles. Lunch invitations became rare, then stopped altogether. It was as if success had become contagious in reverse. People distanced themselves from Ray, as if his sudden fall from grace might affect their own standing. One evening, Ray found his family photo had been removed from the company's Wall of Achievement display in the lobby. The space where his Employee of the Year photo once hung now showed a generic motivational poster about teamwork. The irony wasn't lost on him. Mrs. Rodriguez, the cleaning lady, noticed him staring at the empty space. "They can take down pictures," she said quietly while dusting nearby, "but they cannot take away what you built." Her words carried the weight of someone who had seen history repeat itself too many times. During team meetings, Ray watched as his suggestions were ignored, only to be praised when repeated by others minutes later. His quarterly reports, once highlighted as examples of excellence, now returned covered in red marks questioning his basic judgment. The final blow came when he discovered his biggest remaining client, Henderson Global, had been invited to a strategy meeting without his knowledge. He learned about it only when he overheard 2 junior associates discussing the presentation in the break room. They fell silent when they noticed him, their faces flushed with guilt. Ray spent that evening updating his journal, his pen moving steadily across the page. Each entry told part of a larger story, one of systematic exclusion wrapped in the language of corporate restructuring. The pattern was clear, even if the words were carefully chosen to seem innocent. As he worked late again, the office empty except for the distant sound of vacuum cleaners, Ray noticed his reflection in his darkened computer screen. The same face that had smiled from award ceremony photos stared back at him, unchanged except for the new lines of determination around his eyes. His phone buzzed with a text from his mother. "Remember what Dad always said, your dignity isn't in their hands." Ray smiled, drawing strength from the wisdom of generations who had faced similar battles. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, But tonight, he would hold on to his father's words and his own unshakable sense of self-worth. The morning started like any other, with Ray organizing his desk and preparing for the day ahead. The office hummed with its usual energy, but something felt different. The whispers seemed louder, the glances more obvious, and the tension in the air was almost visible. He just settled into reviewing his morning emails when Lisa, the HR coordinator, appeared at his desk. "Mr. Preston would like to see you in the conference room," she said, her voice professionally neutral but her eyes avoiding his. Ray noticed she was carrying a thick folder. The walk to the conference room felt longer than usual. Through the glass walls, he could see Preston Jr. seated at the head of the table, typing on his laptop. Next to him sat Mr. Thompson from legal, arranging papers with methodical precision. "Please have a seat," Preston Jr. said without looking up. The chair felt cold and uncomfortable as Ray sat down. The room, usually filled with the energy of creative meetings and successful presentations, now felt like a courtroom. "We've received some concerning reports about your behavior," Preston Jr. began, finally closing his laptop. "Multiple colleagues have expressed feeling intimidated by your presence." Ray felt his heart rate quicken, but kept his expression calm. These were words he'd heard before, not directed at him, but at others who looked like him. The old, tired stereotypes dressed up in corporate language. "I have documented feedback here," Preston Jr. continued, sliding a paper across the table. "Instances of aggressive behavior, unwillingness to adapt to company culture, and difficulty working with team members." Each accusation felt like a carefully placed brick in a wall built to keep him out. Ray reached for the paper with steady hands, years of professional experience helping him maintain his composure. The document was filled with vague accusations and unnamed sources. These incidents, he began carefully, when did they allegedly occur? "That's not relevant to today's discussion," Preston Jr. cut him off. "What's relevant is that your presence is creating an uncomfortable work environment. Despite our attempts to help you adjust to our company culture, you've shown resistance to change." In that moment, Ray thought about all the late nights, the successful campaigns, the grateful clients, and the junior employees he'd mentored. He thought about Mrs. Rodriguez's quiet wisdom and his father's words about dignity. "I'd like to see the specific incidents," Ray said, his voice firm but professional. "And I'd like to know why I wasn't informed of these concerns before today." The legal representative shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Your attitude right now is exactly what we're talking about," Preston Jr. said, his voice taking on an edge. "This defensiveness, this unwillingness to accept feedback, it's just not working out. We need people who can blend in better." What Preston Jr. didn't notice was the small red light blinking on the conference room's video conferencing system. Emmy, his executive assistant, had been setting up for a later meeting when everything started. She sat quietly in the adjacent control room, a hand covering her mouth as she listened to every word. "We're terminating your employment, effective immediately," Preston Jr. announced, pushing a severance package across the table. "You can clean out your desk now. Security will escort you out." Ray sat there, looking at the man who had systematically dismantled his career. He thought about responding, about pointing out the illegality of it all, about mentioning his documented success record. Instead, he simply asked, "Is there anything else?" Preston Jr. seemed almost disappointed by Ray's composure. "You know," he said, leaning back in his chair, "some people just aren't cut out for corporate culture. Maybe you'd be more comfortable somewhere different." As Ray stood to leave, he noticed Amy through the glass, her expression a mix of shock and determination. Their eyes met briefly, and something passed between them. An understanding, a shared recognition of the moment's significance. Security waited by his desk as Ray packed his personal items into a box. His family photo, his awards, his thank you notes from clients. 3 years of excellence reduced to a single cardboard container. Colleagues kept their heads down as he walked past, though a few brave ones made eye contact, their faces showing a mix of sadness and shame. Mrs. Rodriguez was cleaning nearby as Ray walked toward the elevator. She stopped her work and stood straight, looking him in the eye. "Remember," she said softly, "the truth always finds its way out." As the elevator doors closed on his last view of the office, Ray didn't know that the breaking point wasn't just his, it was the company's too. In the control room, Amy sat with her finger hovering over the save button, knowing that what she had just witnessed would change everything. The week after Ray's firing felt like walking through a fog. His apartment, usually a place of comfort, now seemed too quiet during the daytime hours. He spent his mornings updating his resume, though each time he typed out his accomplishments at Preston Marketing, the words felt hollow against the reality of how it had ended. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Need to talk to you. Important. About what happened." The message was followed by an address to a small coffee shop across town. It was signed simply Amy, Preston Jr.'s assistant. Ray hesitated. After everything that had happened, trust didn't come easily. But something in the urgency of the message made him curious. He remembered Emmy's expression through the conference room glass that day, the look of someone who had witnessed something they couldn't ignore. The coffee shop was quiet, tucked away on a side street far from the corporate towers downtown. Annie was already there, sitting in a corner booth, her usually perfect corporate attire replaced by casual clothes. She looked different outside the office, more human, less part of the machine. "I've been losing sleep over what happened," she said as Ray sat down, her hands wrapped tightly around her coffee cup. "What they did to you, it wasn't just wrong. It was illegal." She pulled out her tablet, her hands shaking slightly as she pressed play. The video was crystal clear, every word of that final meeting captured in high definition. Preston Jr.'s dismissive tone, the thinly veiled comments, the complete lack of proper procedure. But it wasn't just that meeting. Amy had been documenting everything for months. "My grandmother," Amy said, her voice getting quieter, "she was a teacher in the 1960s. They fired her because they said she was too old for the job. But really, it was because she spoke up about how they treated certain students differently. I promised myself I'd never stay quiet if I saw something like that happening again." She showed Ray a folder of emails, performance reviews that had been altered, meeting notes where his contributions had been deliberately minimized. "Preston Jr. didn't know I had access to his email archives as his assistant," she explained. "He wasn't as careful as he thought." Just then, Mrs. Rodriguez walked into the coffee shop. Ray looked surprised, but Amy smiled. "I asked her to come," she said. "She has something you need to hear too." Mrs. Rodriguez sat down, still wearing her cleaning uniform from another job. "For 20 years, I watched that company grow," she began. "Old Mr. Preston, he built it on respect. But his son," she shook her head. "You weren't the first, Mejio, but I pray you'll be the last." She pulled out her phone, showing them videos she'd taken while cleaning the executive floor late at night. Videos of Preston Jr. in countless conversations, unguarded moments where his true attitudes slipped out. "The walls have ears," she said with a small smile, "and sometimes they have eyes too." "There are others who want to speak up," Amy added. "The junior staff members who were forced to take over your accounts. They've been keeping records too. Nobody felt right about what was happening, but everyone was scared." Ray looked at the evidence mounting on the coffee shop table, videos, emails, testimonies. The truth, gathered piece by piece by people who refused to be silent witnesses. His hands trembled as he reached for his own notebook, filled with his careful documentation of every incident. "We're not asking you to fight this battle alone," Amy said firmly. "We're ready to stand with you. All of us." She pulled out one final document, a list of names. Current and former employees, clients who had questioned the changes, even people from other companies who had witnessed Preston Jr.'s behavior at industry events. The coffee shop had grown quiet, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across their table. Ray thought about all the people who had faced similar situations, but never found allies, never got the chance to prove the truth of what happened to them. "When I was walking out that day," Ray said slowly, "I thought about all the others who might come after me. About how this cycle just keeps repeating itself because people get away with it." He looked at Amy and Mrs. Rodriguez, these unexpected allies who had risked their own security to do what was right. Mrs. Rodriguez reached across the table and patted his hand. "Sometimes," she said wisely, "justice needs a little help from the cleaning lady." They'd all laughed, breaking the tension that had built up around the serious conversation. As they left the coffee shop, Ray felt something he hadn't since that day in the conference room: hope. Not just for himself, but for every person who had ever faced discrimination behind closed doors, Every worker who had been told they didn't fit the culture, every professional whose excellence was overshadowed by prejudice. The sun was setting as they walked out, casting long shadows behind them. But ahead, the path was getting clearer. The truth wasn't just a weapon for justice, it was a tool for change. And change, as Mrs. Rodriguez had said while dusting those office shelves, always starts with someone brave enough to speak up. Instead of heading straight to a lawyer, Ray made an unexpected decision. He called Mr. Preston Sr.'s home number, the one still saved in his phone from happier days at the company. The old man's wife answered, her voice warm with recognition despite the months that had passed. "He's been worried about the company," she said quietly. "He doesn't say it, but I can tell. Come over for tea tomorrow afternoon." The Preston family home sat on a quiet street lined with old oak trees. It was modest compared to what most people would expect from a successful business owner, a reflection of the older Preston's values. Ray stood at the door, evidence folder tucked under his arm, heart pounding. Mr. Preston Sr. opened the door himself, looking smaller than Ray remembered, but his handshake was still firm. "I've been following the company's numbers," he said as they settled in his study. "They don't tell the whole story, do they?" The study walls were covered with photos, company milestones, family moments, and the history of a business built from scratch. Ray noticed one photo in particular. A much younger Preston Sr. standing proudly in front of his first office, barely more than a converted garage. "Before I show you something, sir," Ray began, "I want you to know this isn't about revenge. It's about making things right." He placed his folder on the desk between them, next to the teacups Mrs. Preston had brought in. As Preston Sr. went through the evidence, the videos, the emails, the testimonies, his hands began to shake. He paused the video of his son's voice, making those thinly veiled comments, looking like each word physically hurt him. "You know," the old man said, his voice heavy with emotion, "my father changed our family name when he came to this country. The original was too ethnic," they told him. Nobody would hire him, rented him. He thought changing it would give his children a better chance. He stood up slowly, walking to an old filing cabinet in the corner. From the bottom drawer, he pulled out a yellowed envelope. Inside was an old document, a name change petition from 1943. The original family name stayed up at them, a reminder of struggles thought long past. "My son," Preston Sr. said, settling back into his chair, "he grew up with privilege he never understood came from sacrifice. From people who faced exactly what he's doing to others." He looked at the evidence again, then at Ray. "We're going to fix this. Today." One phone call later, Preston Jr. arrived, looking annoyed at being summoned. His expression changed when he saw Ray sitting in his father's study. Before he could speak, his father held up the old document. "Sit down," the older man said quietly. "It's time you learned about your grandfather's first job application in this country." The story poured out, how Preston Sr.'s father had been turned away from job after job, despite his qualifications. How he'd finally changed his name just to get his foot in the door. "The company you're running," Preston Sr. continued, his voice gaining strength. "It was built by a man who knew what it felt like to be judged for who he was, not what he could do. And now look at these." He pushed forward the evidence of his son's actions. Preston Jr.'s face went through a series of emotions: defensiveness, anger, shame. "Times are different now," he tried to argue. "The market expects." "The market," his father cut in sharply, "expects excellence." Which is exactly what Ray gave us. "Excellence doesn't have a color, son. You've forgotten who we are, where we came from." The confrontation lasted hours. They talked about the company's founding principles, about the struggles of their own family, about the responsibility that came with power. Annie was called in to verify the evidence. Mrs. Rodriguez arrived later, her quiet dignity adding weight to every word she spoke. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the study's wood panels, Preston Jr. sat in silence, the full weight of his actions finally sinking in. The carefully constructed justifications he built around his behavior crumbled in the face of his own family's history. "I thought I was protecting our company's image," he finally said, his voice small. "But I was betraying everything it was built on." The old clock on the wall ticked steadily as they discussed what would happen next. This wasn't just about Ray anymore. It was about acknowledging a deeper problem and committing to real change. As they left the house that evening, the porch light cast a warm glow on the group: the retired founder, his humbled son, the wronged employee, and the brave witnesses who had refused to stay silent. Each step down the porch stairs felt like moving toward something new, something better. Mrs. Preston appeared at the door one last time, holding out a small photo album. "I think you should all see these," she said. "Sometimes we need to remember where we came from to know where we should be going." Inside were photos of the company's early days, Preston Sr. working alongside people from all walks of life, building something together. It was a reminder that success wasn't built on exclusion, but on recognizing the value in every person who walked through the door. The next few weeks at Preston Marketing buzzed with change. Preston Jr. spent hours in his father's study, going through old family albums and documents. Each yellowed paper and faded photograph told stories of struggle, resilience, and the kind of discrimination his own grandfather had faced. One evening, while sorting through a dusty box of papers, he found his grandfather's original job applications, dozens of them, all rejected. The reasons were vague, professional-sounding excuses that couldn't hide their true meaning. The similarities to Ray's situation hit him like a physical blow. "I found something else," his father said, entering the study with another box. Inside were letters his grandfather had written but never sent, passionate words about the pain of being judged for his name, his accent, his appearance. Preston Jr. read them late into the night, his coffee growing cold beside him. At the office, changes began immediately. Preston Jr. called a company-wide meeting, but this time he chose the small conference room instead of the grand presentation hall. People packed in, shoulder to shoulder, creating an intimacy that made his next words impossible to dismiss. "I've been wrong," he began, his voice wavering slightly. "Not just about one decision or one person, but about the very principles this company was built on." He shared his grandfather's story, holding up the original family documents, letting everyone see the parallel between past and present. The room was silent as he detailed his own biased actions, not hiding behind corporate language or vague explanations. "I lost sight of our history," he admitted. "I became the very thing my grandfather fought against." But words weren't enough. Real change required action. Preston Jr. spent the next few days meeting with every department, listening more than talking. He'd heard stories from employees who had faced subtle discrimination, who had stayed silent out of fear. Each story added another crack to his old worldview. Amy organized a series of lunch meetings where employees could share their experiences openly. The conversations were sometimes uncomfortable, often emotional, but always honest. Preston Jr. attended every single one, not as a CEO, but as someone ready to learn. One day, Mrs. Rodriguez found him staring at the company's mission statement mounted in the lobby. "You know," she said, pausing her cleaning cart, "your grandfather used to say hello to me in my language. He learned it just to make people feel welcome." That comment sparked something. Preston Jr. began taking cultural awareness classes in the evenings. He wasn't doing it for show. He did it quietly, sitting among other students, learning about perspectives he'd never considered before. The changes spread beyond just attitude. He reviewed every company policy with fresh eyes, finding and removing barriers he'd never noticed before. The hiring process was completely restructured to eliminate bias. Performance reviews were made more transparent and objective. But the most significant change was in himself. The prestigious clubs he used to frequent saw less of him. Instead, he spent time in community centers, listening to stories from people his grandfather might have known, understanding their struggles and dreams. One afternoon, he discovered an old recording of his grandfather's voice, captured at a family dinner years ago. "Success isn't just about making money," the scratchy voice said. "It's about lifting others up as you climb." Preston Jr. played that recording every morning before heading to work. The transformation wasn't always smooth. Old habits tried to resurface, unconscious biases needed constant challenging. But each time he caught himself slipping, he remembered his grandfather's rejected job applications, Ray's unjust firing, and the legacy he had almost destroyed. He started keeping a journal, just like Ray had. But instead of documenting discrimination, he documented his own learning journey. Each entry showed another step away from who he had been and toward who he needed to become. During a charity event, someone asked him about the company's recent changes. Instead of giving the polished corporate response he would have used before, He shared his grandfather's story. "We're not just changing policies," he said. "We're remembering who we are." The old guard of clients, the ones who had expected him to maintain certain standards, started expressing concern about the company's new direction. Some threatened to take their business elsewhere. Preston Jr.'s response surprised everyone. "Then perhaps we're not the right fit for each other anymore." Late one evening, as he was leaving the office, he saw a young intern staying late, working on a presentation. The scene reminded him of Ray's dedication. He stopped to offer encouragement, remembering how his grandfather had once been that young person, full of potential, needing just one person to look past prejudice and see talent. As he drove home that night, past the neighborhoods he'd never really looked at before, Preston Jr. realized that true transformation wasn't just about changing actions. It was about changing how you see the world and your place in it. His grandfather had known that. Now finally, he was learning it too. 6 months had passed since that evening in Mr. Preston Sr.'s study. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Preston Marketing Group, illuminating a very different workplace from the one Ray had left that dark day. The lobby now featured a new wall display, "Our Journey of Change." Photos and stories chronicled both the company's proud beginnings and its recent transformation. At the center was the original name change document of Preston Jr.'s grandfather, a reminder of where they came from and why change mattered. Ray stood in front of that wall, straightening his tie. Today wasn't just any morning, it was his first day back, but not in his old role. The nameplate in his hands read Executive Director of Workplace Culture and Inclusion, a position created not just for him, but because of what his experience had taught the company. "Welcome back," Mrs. Rodriguez called out, pushing her cleaning cart past him. She wasn't just the cleaning lady anymore. She now supervised the entire facilities team, her wisdom and observation skills finally recognized with a proper title and salary. The morning meeting felt different from any Ray had attended before. Preston Jr. sat not at the head of the table, but among the team. Emmy, now head of human resources, presented the company's new mentorship program designed to support employees from all backgrounds. "Our latest surveys show a 90% increase in employee satisfaction," Emmy reported, her voice proud. "And our client base has actually grown, despite losing some who didn't appreciate our new direction." She nodded toward Ray, acknowledging his role in this transformation. Preston Jr. stood up next. "6 months ago, I thought I was protecting this company's image. Instead, I was destroying everything it stood for." He paused, looking around the room. "But today, we're building something better. Something my grandfather would be proud of." The changes weren't just internal. Preston Marketing had partnered with civil rights organizations to create training programs for other companies. Ray's story, with his permission, became a case study in corporate transformation. What had started as one man's struggle was helping create change across the industry. During lunch, Ray sat with a group of new hires in the break room. They were a diverse group, hired for their talent and potential, not how well they fit an outdated mold. One young employee asked about the photo on the wall, the one showing Ray's return to the company. "Sometimes," Ray explained, "the worst moments in our lives can lead to the best changes if we're brave enough to stand up and if others are brave enough to stand with us." He looked over at Emmy, who was adding sugar to her coffee, and Mrs. Rodriguez, who was enjoying her lunch break with the team instead of eating alone. The afternoon brought a surprise visit from Mr. Preston Sr., who now regularly checked in on the company's progress. He walked slowly through the offices, stopping to chat with employees, his face brightening at the energy and diversity he saw around him. "You know," he said to Ray as they walked together, "my father would work late every night, cleaning offices much like Mrs. Rodriguez did. He did it because no one would hire him for his skills, but he kept detailed notes about how each business operated, learning everything he could. That's how he knew how to build this company when he finally got his chance." In the executive conference room, a new tradition had started. Every Friday, employees from all levels gathered to share stories and ideas. Today, a junior designer presented his concept for a campaign celebrating different cultural perspectives. Preston Jr. listened intently, asking questions that showed genuine interest rather than judgment. As the day drew to a close, Ray found himself back at his old desk, now belonging to a promising young account manager. The space felt different, not because of any physical changes, but because of what it represented. It was no longer just a workspace, it was a symbol of opportunity, of second chances, of real change. Preston Jr. caught up with Ray in the parking lot. "You know," he said, "I've been thinking about what success really means. My grandfather didn't build this company just to make money. He built it to prove that everyone deserves a fair chance. It just took us a while to remember that." The setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple as employees left for the day. Some headed to evening classes the company now sponsored, others to family dinners they no longer had to miss due to excessive overtime. A few stayed behind for a voluntary diversity committee meeting, including Preston Jr., who now attended not as a boss, but as someone still learning. Ray took one last look at the building before getting into his car. The company logo shone brightly against the darkening sky, but now it stood for something more than just business success. It represented hope. Hope that when people face their mistakes, when they choose to learn and grow, real change is possible. Mrs. Rodriguez, leaving for the day, stopped by his car. "You see," she said with a knowing smile, "sometimes the truth doesn't just come out, it makes everything better." She patted his arm and walked away, her proud posture reflecting her new position and the dignity she always possessed. The story of Preston Marketing's transformation began spreading through the business community. Other companies started reaching out, asking for guidance on their own journeys of change. What had started as one man's stand against discrimination had grown into something larger, a model for how businesses could grow, learn, and become better. As Ray drove home, he thought about all the people who had played a part in this change. Annie with her courage to record the truth, Mrs. Rodriguez with her quiet wisdom, Mr. Preston Sr. with his commitment to his father's values, and even Preston Jr., who had found the strength to face his own biases and change. Sometimes, he realized, the biggest victories don't come from defeating others, but from helping them become better people.